This episode of Morning Tempo is brought to you by the Unstarving Musician podcast, another podcast in which yours truly speaks with indie musicians and music industry professionals to discuss the various elements of the music business. This week's featured episode on the Unstarving Musician is with Ryan Dusick, a founding member of Maroon 5 and author of Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all, and finding recovery. It comes out November this year, 2022. These days, Ryan is an associate marriage and family therapist, and the importance of this episode and its possible relevance to you or someone you know is that Ryan's story, as the title of his new book would imply, is an in-depth look at his journey from the heights of international stardom to the depths of addiction, anxiety, chronic injury, and depression. Harder to Breathe chronicles Ryan's remarkable recovery and his transition from the music industry to professional counseling, where he's helped hundreds of clients overcome mental and physical challenges. Emotional and physical well-being is a topic important to all of us, so if you think it might help someone you know, please share the episode. You can think of it as a public service. You can hear this episode of The Unstarving Musician on Apple Podcasts and read more about it at unstarvingmusician.com. I'll put a link in the show notes, of course. And now, let's do this show. This is the Morning Tempo Podcast. I am your host, Rabanzo. On this podcast, I have conversations with business owners and the entrepreneurial with the slant toward creativity. It's an opportunity for you to learn with me from people who are finding success in the business world, all intended to make your entrepreneurial journey a little bit easier. Welcome to another episode of Morning Tempo. In recent excitement, the wife and I very recently celebrated Mexican Independence Day with friends, which was loads of fun. And we have our first visitors coming from the US of A. We are very excited about that, or muy emocionados, as the Spanish expression goes. My guest for this episode is Kison Patel. Kison is the founder and CEO of M&A Science, a community of forward-thinking M&A practitioners on a mission to perfect the M&A practice. He was an M&A advisor for 10 years, having sold large companies such as commercial banks and hotel chains. In 2012, he noticed teams lacked efficient technology to manage deals and thus created DealRoom, an M&A lifecycle management platform. In 2016, he started the M&A Science podcast and devoted his time to creating a platform where all the best practitioners could share best practices and lessons learned from real-life deals. Kison then created the M&A Science Academy in 2020 to offer step-by-step training to those looking to master M&A, featuring courses created by top-level practitioners. Through developing technology, educational content, and industry training, Kison aims to bring better practices to an industry with growing market pressures, transaction values, and competition. I confessed in our conversation that my exposure to M&A is limited, has been limited, but I had observed through personal experience that it was a business space that is very behind the times. We talk a good deal about this and the impact starting a podcast has had on Kison's business, creating educational content and products in the M&A space, how the competitive landscape is responding to the work of his companies, and more. With that, here is me speaking with Kison Patel. Are you in Chicago today?
I'm in Santa Monica today.
Santa Monica in California?
Yep.
Nice weather?
It's not bad. It was, I don't know. It was 60s the last couple of days.
Yeah, it's still not bad. You travel a lot for work?
It's just recently been picking back up, and I think just now, why not?
Yeah.
If I can go work in California while Chicago's a little colder than I like it to be.
Is it miserable in Chicago weather-wise, temperature-wise right now?
I don't know what it is. I've had like 40 Midwest winters and I'm just like over it. I got a young staff that travels all around and they're living up the remote work culture. And I'm like, I'm taking after them. Like it's, I don't want to be one of the ones trying to harp at people to go back in the office. Let's just enjoy it and embrace the new world.
Yeah, no kidding. I guess that's one silver lining we have. How long have you, by the way, known the folks at Podcast Virtuoso? Do you work with Joshua Buebo directly by chance?
Yeah, I know him. I've known the founder of the company I met as like a young entrepreneur. And when he told me about what he was doing, I said, hey, I have a PR contract that's winding down. Why don't I give you guys a shot and see what you can do? And I think they do a good. I think fundamentally they got a good model.
Mm.
I think that they're early, but they'll get there.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, they've been good. They've been good to work with.
So given the mission at, wow, I want to say M&A Science. That's not what I want to say. What's your other company? Gosh, DealRoom. Forgive me. You have a lot of
Well, M&A Science like our umbrella brand, so we tend
Okay.
to have everything nested under M&A Science. But in the
Okay.
market, people really know DealRoom is our flagship product.
Okay. Oh, thanks for clarifying. So what I wanted to ask is, given the mission to perfect the M&A space, what's wrong with it? What is it lacking?
It's highly inefficient. This is a space that's antiquated. They're still operating off of a model that's from 20 years ago. So if you look at the tools, they're using primarily Excel to track the whole process up and down from beginning to end. And we're talking about some large billion-dollar transactions even. And then the practices part too. A lot of the industry has operated for decades in this state of secrecy where you can't tell anybody what we're doing. And the nature of that's true. Like in an M&A deal, there's a lot of sensitivity around the nature of the deal and keeping the confidentiality. But a lot of the problems that happen in M&A fundamentally are very similar. At the end of the day, these corporations are trying to solve the similar challenges, which entail how do you manage the process efficiently? How do you keep various stakeholders aligned on the priority tasks as you move through a deal process? How do you communicate effectively with other participants involved that are more or less impacted by the change that happens from M&A? So the employees, the customers, the vendors. How do you manage the change and keeps the stakeholder alignment as you act on your plans or integration plans to generate value from your investment without upsetting a bunch of people and causing them to quit and leave their job? So that's the challenge with M&A. In short, it is a very large magnitude of change, probably the largest an organization will go through, and can be highly disruptive. And there needs to be a better way to approach it to focus more on the people so the results can be better.
It looks like your company's able to work with relatively, if not outright large organizations. Given the new model that you have, are you able to also bring that down to the space where some of the smaller businesses are involved in M&A as well?
I'm hoping fundamentally, yeah, that's the goal. We went upstream. We started working with boutique firms and have gone up to work with multinational corporations.
Oh, okay.
I think for us, there's a driver of getting involved with the big deals are exciting, but the complexity to be able to help problem solve some of these challenges that get very complex, especially when you're dealing with a large scale of a transaction that involves thousands of people. That's exciting stuff for us. But when we look at fundamentally the shift of going from a finance focused M&A approach to a people focused M&A approach could be applied across industry. I think building the stuff and demonstrating that it works in the most complex situations lends to fundamentally this should work as well in less complex situations.
From the limited exposure I've had to M&A in the boutique space, I can see that it's a highly sort of behind the times or antiquated model that's used. Did you find that when you started approaching some of the larger enterprise deals that a different type of, but the same sort of outdatedness existed in the way they do things?
Yes, but different motivation actually improve. When we first started, we were selling in investment banks and working with them, and the incentives aren't aligned. When you look at all the vendors involved in M&A transaction, the consultants, the lawyers, the bankers, a lot of them actually profit off of the inefficiencies in the industry, right?
Oh no.
I actually had one of the directors at a consulting firm tell me, he said, hey, I love what you're doing, love the ideas and concepts, but there's one thing I got to keep in mind. The inefficiencies you're talking about, I actually bill for those. I bill for those inefficient hours. That's what helps me get my quota for the year. So I think that that's one of the challenges with some of the providers, is that the incentives aren't aligned. Even with investment banks, they get a success fee, but then a lot of times the banker leading the deal, he gets a percentage of the fee on the total amount, not the net. So there's, again, no incentives to drive efficiency to the bottom line. But when we saw corporates, there's just so much involved where they had to take ownership of the deal, including the end results after the transaction's done. A lot of those providers, once the transaction's done, they wipe their hand clean and move on. Where the corporates, they run the whole process from beginning to close and after close, and they hold accountability, especially the direction corporates are moving now. It's more about the end results. Then we saw greater emphasis or interest for them to improve what they're doing, to optimize their process, to deliver better results.
Well, yeah, I'm just trying to imagine. I can see that they would have to take ownership at the corporate, the bigger corporate level, and trying to imagine what all that has looked like, and how the big opportunities you have for sort of disrupting everything that's going on. You mentioned, or we were talking about the podcast earlier, and you mentioned the M&A Science podcast. When did it start? How's it going? How is it working with the business?
It's one of the things I'm most thankful for, is getting into podcasting. I got into around 2017 with encouragement. A good friend of mine, Andy. Andy was a marketer who was like advocate for startups, loved startups, played around with other companies in the B2C, done B2B work. And he kept advocating for it. He's like, hey man, you got to do a podcast. And I was like, what the hell's a podcast? And he just came back and, don't worry about it, it's gonna be the next big thing. I was fortunate. They had Podcast Movement was doing a conference in Chicago that year.
Oh, nice.
So he's like, hey, you should just go to this conference and check it out. And I got to go in there and explore the ecosystem. I got to network with a bunch of other podcasters. I got to meet the vendors. I got to go test a bunch of microphones, see which ones that really I liked.
Yeah.
And it was good. I got into it. I wasn't super, I mean, mind you, I'm a big introvert. I don't like public speaking at the time. I was go to these networking events. I tend to be a wallflower. So I pushed myself to do it, get out of the comfort zone. And I remember just doing about 10 of these interviews the first year. And I figured, look, at the very least, we can use these podcast interviews and turn them into blog content, which we did do. And I remember it wasn't until the second year I started actually looking at the data that, hey, people are actually listening to this thing. And then you have to stick to it. When you stick with it, it grows. I think the thing we did really well was think of ways to repurpose content. We kept the podcast as an educational content series. And we also built it around a mission, which I think was critical to the success of the podcast, where even though our main business was focused in software and helping organizations solve problems with software solutions, we realized there was this bigger underpinning problem in the industry, in that the industry itself was very siloed off, disconnected from their peers. There was a lack of standardization and best practices. Every time we kept working with a new firm, we had to relearn how they thought about M&A and approached M&A. And that led to the idea of, why not use a podcast as a platform to enable practitioners to be able to share lessons learned, and in turn, extract those techniques. What are the proven techniques? Identify them by identifying the patterns. And that's what led to a lot of various content that we were able to assemble through doing a series of podcasts. In fact, one of the notable resources we created was a book in 2020 that was based on a series of podcasts that ultimately were case studies with Google and Atlassian, and how they utilize agile techniques stemming from their engineering culture and applying it to M&A. And that did really well, allowed us to get involved with various conference platforms, speak at a number of large corporations.
Wow.
And then we just continued to read. And I think even the book we repurposed as long form content, but we would always take excerpts out of it and post it on social media and get conversations around it.
Yeah.
So there's a lot you can do. And I think that's one of the key things when you get a podcast. one, build a mission around it so that you really have a clear purpose. And then two, go beyond it. Like find, I mean, even today, I look at the podcast has evolved into a full blown digital media business. We do events. We're launching another roundtable event series. We run an online academy program, and it just continues to expand. And once you get that community, you get the feedback from the community and identify what products and services they would benefit from and do your best to provide that to them.
I'm really glad I asked that question as a podcaster. That's a great story wrapped up in there. And so the book that you referred to in this case was Agile M&A?
Yep.
Is that the one that
Agile
came
M&A
out
was
most
the
recently?
first book we published in 2020.
Okay. And then you have another one, I don't know the order of them, but M&A, the M&A Tactics Handbook, and there's a third one coming out or just that has come out, right?
We're working on a third one right now. M&A Tactics is a book that features highlights of podcasts we did over a year.
Okay.
It really extracts what were some of the takeaways and key lessons, which it almost creates like an index. If somebody doesn't have time to listen to 40
Sure.
hours of content, they could run through, get all the highlights, and then decide where they want to spend their time. The third book we're building is a much bigger project. It's a reference book. We've again paying attention to the market, getting feedback. We've seen a big uptick in IPOs this past year, and with that, a lot of those organizations are standing up an M&A function. And even though they're hiring the best talent from the top tier firms, the Google, Microsoft, Cisco, there's no clear playbook to stand up an M&A function. And what we wanted to do was use our ability to aggregate and crowdsource these different resources and expertise into a reference book that would include templates and help guide somebody that's going through that process be able to do it right the first time.
Well, kudos to you guys for recognizing and capitalizing on those different opportunities. What have you learned about yourself with the whole podcasting experience?
You can always improve. I, I encourage it. I like going back, speaking to undergrad students, and even at that age, I encourage them do a podcast. You know, there's one thing that you learn about networking and connecting with folks to expand your learning pattern, because you can obviously learn from content we find online and reading books, but you should have subject matter experts as a part of that in how you learn. It's one thing to go reach out, network, and ask for time to learn from someone's experience. But if you can approach somebody about interviewing them for a podcast, it changes the dynamic significantly, where instead of asking for a favor for their time, you're essentially doing them a favor by helping them get their brand and messaging out there.
Yeah.
And it gives you access to people that may otherwise be difficult to access. So that's fundamental. It's great for networking and helping you build relationships. On the personal level, communication, you will get better at speaking, especially if you plug in the full podcast setup and have the monitoring headset and you actually listen to yourself as you're speaking, because you're monitoring the final recording. And it's a little awkward in the beginning, but it'll help you. It'll give you a good idea of how many filler words you're using, make you very conscious about how you're speaking, your tone, your speed, and those things. I think especially when you get conscious about it, I took a voice lesson. I need to get better. I need to go start picking up the practice or the warm-ups again, but it challenges you. So I think there's a lot of good benefits that in personal development with communication that's applicable everywhere in every conversation that you have that you develop from podcasting.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. And in the early days when I was doing them, I would listen to and released a lot of sort of really unedited versions of it just so I could torture myself and remind myself of all those bad habits and tics that I have. And I can honestly say, I published probably over 250 episodes cumulatively. And in listening to some recent ones, I thought to myself the other day, I think I'm getting better now with all the filler words. So
somebody asked me once about starting a podcast, and I was scrambling a little bit. Like, what do you tell somebody? Because I remember I obsessed over equipment, but I'm a tech geek, so that was sort of inherent in my nature.
Yeah.
But I told him, you know what, just record your first recording and make it as terrible as you can make it. And they kind of looked at me like, why would you do that? I said, because that way when you record 100, you can look back and be like, damn, I got good. So
That's not bad advice. That's not bad advice at all. Did your life in the M&A world start out anything like it is today, or did you start out in this world where things were just woefully behind the times and moved yourself into where you're at now?
it was behind the time. We still have a lot of work to do. I think I've grown quite a bit because I came from a background where I focused on these private transactions that were much smaller. They were
Mm-hmm.
$5 to $20 million most often. And I'd always lose out every time I got up to the $100 million, I'd lose out to a bigger firm. So I had my frustrations there where I felt like I hit this glass ceiling unless I could get into an organization. But I wanted to stay independent. I wanted to be the owner operator. So I saw tech as an avenue to be able to create solutions and scale it and make a bigger impact. The industry hasn't changed, but my view and understanding of the industry has changed quite a bit. I think the thing is being curious and hungry to learn
Mm-hmm.
and keeping that, because going from one end where I personally worked on these smaller transactions to today, or this past year, we worked on multiple multi-billion-dollar transactions. That is really significant. I think that just the understanding of how those deals operate, the scale, the unique challenges they have. Now it's less focus on putting the deal together, which was always the big thing back then, to more of how are we actually going to get the value out of this deal? How are we going to align the 500 plus people that we need to actually deliver on this investment thesis to make the value realization occur? And it's really different there, and it's talking to more the sophisticated practitioners with unique backgrounds. I think too, I was very much focused in one industry, and then I moved into another industry. Today, we're across so many different industries that it's always exciting to get in, learn about an organization, how they've achieved their success in the industry they've developed. That's where it keeps it really interesting in the practice that we develop. So I think that's the big part. And then the learning part's obviously core. We have educational podcasts, the school,
Mm-hmm.
but even just competency in our approach in building capabilities centered around learning, trying to learn as much as you can. Internally, we're constantly sharing white papers, the consulting firms are publishing, anything we can find relevant to the industry to stay up to date, but then also go beyond that. Can we identify some of these trends? Can we constantly find ways to learn from peers? So we're doing one later today. We have a roundtable event to talk about the topic for the book we're publishing. Can we bring these other experts in to chime in and share their experiences?
I'm reminded of a friend of mine from when I was in high school, and I actually had him on the podcast. He's got an interesting business he's had going for years and has had some nice growth. I believe they are privately held, but he told me at one point that his best customer was an educated customer he learned over the years. And it sounds like with a lot of the work you're doing with the podcast and books and these other different things you've talked about, that both an educated customer or client and an educated space in general is really great for you guys. Is that true on both fronts?
I'd say educating, but in being the educator, if you can, even though you might not have developed it, you might have at least brought them the subject matter expert, which we do a lot of the guest interviews.
Sure.
Or we've developed some of this internally, but being able to develop it and deliver it, being that educator is a key component, because that's where you build the trust. That's one of the things. It's having the educated customer, but then also being the one that they know where that information is coming from, so that you build that persona brand relationship with. That's what ultimately that you're striving for, is to build trust with this community. I think that's where keeping that front and center is a focus.
Mm-hmm.
And just what does it take to build trust? And it's often the North Star is doing the right thing.
That makes a lot of sense, though. And what about in the time that you've been helping or attempting to transform the space of M&As and all the things that surround it? Have you seen the competitive landscape changing or evolving with you or seeing new competitors come on and sort of adopting these more, I guess, modern approaches?
Yeah, we haven't seen a lot of new competitors, but we've seen our existing competitors step up their game, which is nice to see.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to. They don't have a choice, but it is good. I think it's, like I said, there's still a long ways to go. We're in a really slow moving industry. We get a lot of inquiries about, oh, AI, this and that, and we learned a hard lesson investing early in AI. We're like, wait a minute, we need to get people off of Excel first. We still got a ways to go before we do that, but we're always looking around what's around the corner. But yeah, I mean, the competition does come. I get flattered when they sort of can tell they're modeling off of things we've already done,
Mm-hmm.
which is what it is. It's a form of flattery, but it's always staying focused and being original, like really staying focused on the customer. And this is like the very cliche thing that everybody says, is obsessing over them, really understanding, but like actually doing it. It's one thing to talk about it,
Mm-hmm.
but to actually do it and look at yourself and understand, okay, how much time am I actually spending with customers, digging in and problem solving with them? Because you might find that you're not spending as much time as you think. Are you actually spending at least 30% of your time having those conversations with customers and solving their problems? I think that's where you really learn the most, where you can learn about the experience you're creating for the customer, the way that the way you can build your organization around creating value for them. What capabilities do you need to create to provide that value? I mean, you might not have it, but can you bring it to them and deliver the value? Because I think that's another whole nother conversation topic, but we get obsessed over creating this capability of the value. But I feel like the bigger problem in the world right now is the distribution or the delivery of value. That there's a lot of people that have crafted solutions in various forms as services and products.
Yeah.
But the bigger problem is getting it to the right people that would benefit the most from it. I mean, you can walk down to 10 companies, and 9 out of 10 will tell you that's their biggest challenge, is getting their product or solution to the customer. So a lot of times you don't really need to create something. I get the aspiring entrepreneurs that are rushing to build this new product or solution, but the hardest part is figuring out the distribution. How do you get it to the right people? How do you get them to build the trust in an organization to get the services from, and have the right channels to do it and the right team to deliver it and make sure that they find success with the solution? That's right. Oftentimes I think a lot of entrepreneurs, I challenge them. I say, "Why focus on that part? If you can build that out, you can actually get a lot further." And I think that's where most of the opportunity is right now, is really figuring out how do you distribute your products and services in an efficient way.
Yeah, that's kind of the crux of everything creative and business. You make this thing, and then the real work is ahead of you, getting it to the right place.
The easy part is building the product. That's where I feel like the trend needs to shift, where it's do the opposite. Like, don't worry about building the product. Just find products you like, distribute it. Once you build your distribution model, then you can plug in products. Then you'll create revenue a lot quicker, easier, without having to have a bunch of upfront expenses. Then you can plug in your own products.
Yeah, solid advice. I noticed on your LinkedIn that you are involved, and I don't know to what degree, and that it's an active organization, how active they are and how involved you are, but the Forbes Technology Council, which made me just want to ask how you are involved in tech from an interest perspective, and both trying to further, whether it's knowledge or advancement in areas that may not necessarily directly, or seemingly anyway, directly impact what you're doing.
I try to be helpful. I think as an early entrepreneur, your first measure of success is generating it, getting a business profitable, generating your own personal wealth, stability, and things of that sort. It's very personal. But once you achieve those things, it shifts to, can I create this ability in others? Can I help them achieve their success? So that's where I like to find opportunities to give back, to help others, whether they're just learning the basics of business, or if they're looking to start a company, and find some of these things where I have experience. And sometimes a lot of it's just give them the hard truth about what it actually entails to achieve it. I look for that. There's various platforms out there. I think the challenge gets when you do run a business that is growing and scaling. It's difficult to provide as much time as the early days when you really don't. But then when you do develop the skills and have the ability, you're running a business that's growing. It gets difficult to allocate the time. But I still carve out a few hours on the weekends to help with those things.
That's great. I like that. So mascience.com, right? That's the sort of the main place where people can find out about everything you're doing?
Absolutely. If anybody's interested in M&A, learning about it, learning about the multiple careers in M&A that tend to be a little hidden since we don't expose our undergrad students to them.
Okay.
And then even existing practitioners looking to advance their skills, mascience.com. We have tons of content on there.
Great. Kison, it was a pleasure chatting with you today. I really appreciate it. And I should have asked you this at the outset. Did I pronounce your name correctly?
Kison, yeah, absolutely.
Kison?
Yep.
Like a key. Okay. I didn't, but thank you for cutting me some slack.
Close enough.
Kison, have a wonderful afternoon. It's great talking with you, man.
Hey, my pleasure, Roberto. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I don't know why, but I find M&A kind of fascinating. I am down to the last couple of pre-recorded interviews for this podcast as I contemplate a new direction for it. Speaking with mostly entrepreneurs has been a lot of fun, so too has been speaking with authors. I'm thinking of leaning into the creativity angle a bit harder, perhaps things like design, film and video, visual art. We'll see. I believe this will better complement my Unstarving Musician podcast in a new way, so, stay tuned. If you'd like to keep up with my weird world and some of the insightful and useful things I'm learning from guests or otherwise discovering on my own, head over to morningtempo.com to sign up for my monthly Muse letter. Yes, Muse, M-U-S-E. It's a great way to support the podcast. It's free and you can unsubscribe at any time. This podcast exists in part through No, not in part, entirely through the generosity of its listeners. If you found value in this episode, please follow us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps others discover it. And to learn about the variety of ways you can support the podcast, please visit morningtempo.com/crowdsponsor. Thanks again for listening. That is a wrap. I am peacing out. Enjoy your day. Be kind to others, stay creative, and stay curious.